Hey guys, welcome in. Today we are going to be working on clay lesson number 2 in Google Classroom. You're going to need a few things for today's assignment, including your clay that you should have all stored in your plastic bag, your plastic slip cup, your black plastic knife, perhaps some paper towels, a bowl of water, which I do not have prepared quite yet, and you'll also need all of your clay pieces that you made during our last clay lesson, which includes your very thin coil that should now be dry, as well as your other 2 dried pieces, which is your thin slab and your appropriately thick slab. So go ahead and get all those things out and we will get started shortly. All right, let's get started. So today we are going to be doing 3 things. First things first, we are going to check out all of our dry pieces from last class. Then we are going to start making our slip. Making slip is usually a 2-class process, so today we're just going to be doing the first part of that. The third thing we're going to be doing today is creating a pinch pot. So by the end of today, you should be able to take a photo of not just your slip that you've started, but also the pinch pot you've created, and that will be what you submit for Google Classroom. So let's first look at your dry pieces that you guys made the other day. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at these dry pieces and noticing a few qualities about them. So first thing I would like you to look at is your coil. So notice, what color is it? It's no longer dark gray, right? I know this might seem obvious, but it is now light gray. So if you're working on your projects in the future and you start noticing some areas are turning light gray, that might mean those areas are drying out. If you're still working on your project, you don't want your clay to dry out that much because it's going to lead to a lot of challenges. For example, clay, as it starts getting dry, it's a lot harder to move. For example, as you can obviously tell, I can't bend this into a squiggly shape anymore like I used to be able to do when it was soft. So as clay gets dry, it's going to be a lot harder to quite literally move. It also becomes a lot more brittle, kind of in that same notion. For example, if this was fresh clay and I dropped it on this table surface, it probably wouldn't break. It would probably just kind of smush a little. However, if I were to drop this piece of clay on the surface, I hope it does it, or this is going to be embarrassing. Perfect. Then it broke into a bunch of tiny pieces. So dry clay is brittle. That was actually perfectly done. All these little clay bits are going to help us in a moment when we make our slip. So additionally, we can compare that by looking at our 2 slabs that we made. So we have our very thin slab and our thick slab. Both of these are technically dry. You might notice that your thicker slab might actually be a little bit less dry than your thin slab, depending on how long you've let it sit out. Thin clay is going to dry a lot quicker than thick clay. So you may or may not notice, if you were to hold both pieces of clay, it's possible that this piece of clay, your thicker slab, might feel a little bit cold, whereas this one, the thin slab, might feel more room temperature. That's because fresh clay is generally a little colder because it holds moisture than dry clay. And it's very possible that since this is thicker and it's been drying more slowly, that the inside core of this piece might still be a little damp, which might relate to the cold feeling of this piece. So that's kind of a lesson in itself. Thicker clay might look dry on the outside, but it could actually still be damp on the inside. You can tell if it's still damp by holding it and if it feels cold. Again, this may or may not be fully dry depending on how long you've let it sit out. Your thin piece, on the other hand, is definitely fully dry. You'll also notice that the thinner your clay is, the more brittle it is. So just like the coil broke into a zillion pieces, I'm going to drop both of these pieces at the same time on the tabletop. Let's see what happens without me giving anything away. Let me scooch the camera forward just a little bit. We've got our 2 pieces of clay. Let's see what happens when we drop both of them. Okay, so as you can see, the thicker slab is a little bit more sturdy. It didn't break at all. The thin slab, although it didn't break much, it definitely did break into two pieces as I dropped it from about a foot high in the air. So that's an additional lesson, basically just to be careful. So as you make your projects, when they do become dry, you will have to be very careful with them, because if they drop, even from a short distance, this can happen. Once clay is dry, it is near impossible to really reattach it. So be very careful with drying projects. So now that we've gotten to analyze the aspects of dry clay, what we're going to do is we're going to use this dry clay to create slip. So what you will need to do is, if you have your coil in larger chunks, break it up into tiny pieces like this. As well, take your thin slab and also break that up into little tiny pieces. Great. Now, I would love to say to also break this piece up into tiny pieces, your thicker slab, but you'll notice as you go to break it, it's kind of hard to break. Realistically too, when we make slip, the tinier pieces of clay are gonna work a lot better. So we'll simply take this piece and we'll consider it scrap. So you can go ahead and throw this piece out. However, keep all these tiny little bits of whatever clay you've been able to break up that is dry. So to make slip, you're going to take your slip cup included in your clay kit. As you open it up, you'll notice that there is a toothpick and a paper clip in there. You will not need those for today, so just set them aside somewhere safe. This was just used to store those while your clay kits were in transport. Next, take your slip cup and add all of your little dry clayed bits to it. In a perfect scenario, your clay bits would fill up maybe about 3/4 of the cup, but it's likely yours will only get about as full as mine, which is right about there, and that's totally fine. You can always make more slip down the road after you run out. This will just be a great way to get us started. So I've got all my dry clay bits in my cup. It's important that the clay is dry, because what we're next going to do is we're going to be adding water to this. Dry clay is going to soak up water much better than damp, fresh clay will. So that's why it's important to have dry clay in here. So you can do this any sort of way you'd like. You can take your slip cup over to a sink if you'd like. I'm simply going to use the bowl of water because I have it right here for the demo. But you are going to add some water to your slip cup. Ideally, you want the water to completely cover all of the dry clayed bits. It's better to have a little too much water than too little water. Okay, I definitely put quite a lot in here, definitely more than enough. I hope this angle works out well enough for you guys. My water is about 2/3 of the way up, whereas my clay bits were only about 1/3 of the way up. What's going to happen now is the dry clay is going to soak in all the water, and it's going to start taking the clay and turning it basically into a mud. You're going to be really tempted to want to stir all of this up. However, I encourage you, once you pour the water, just let it sit. We're gonna let it sit all the way until next class. The reason is, if you stir this up, it's gonna take the clay bits and it's gonna take the water and it's gonna start mixing it. However, if the outside of our clay bits end up having this weird muddy like coating on it, which would happen from mixing it, the clay is not gonna soak up the water very well. So that's why it's important. Put in the water, just let it sit. Don't touch it. You'll notice, you can't really see it too well in mine, but there might be some bubbles and fizzly sounds. That's totally normal. That's just all the water going into all the pores of your dry clay. And you can see mine is already starting to break down, which is really great. After you're done with that, you've done the first stage of getting your slip ready, and you can set it to the side. Again, be careful not to shake it up. All right, so for our third thing that we are going to be doing today, we are going to be creating a pinch pot. You might recall from our prior ceramics lessons that a pinch pot is essentially just a small bowl made by hand out of clay. So let's get started. First, you're going to take your clay that is in your plastic bag and bring it on out. Whenever you bring out your clay, you always kind of want to assess with what you have. Just as I mentioned the other day, poke around the edges, make sure everything's soft, see if your knuckles can still go into the sides. That gives you an idea on if you have to add a good amount of water to your bag, and if so, how much. It's always great to prevent your clay from getting dry because that is much easier than actually fully rehydrating it. All right, so next I'm gonna cut off some clay to make my pinch pot with. Just as a heads up, people tend to grab too much clay on accident when they go to make a pinch pot. The reason is, you might think that you'll need this much clay in a ball-sized shape to create a pinch pot this big. But remember, the pinch pot ends up being hollow, so all the clay gets pushed to the outsides. So you'd be surprised, you really don't need a large amount of clay to create a small pinch pot. Okay, so you can see about how much clay I got there. I cut off a pretty decent sized corner from my block, but not a crazy amount. Let me kind of start kneading and wedging this, and you'll be able to see how much clay this really is once I kind of wrap it up into a ball shape. But first, as always, we want to take our clay and protect it, so we're going to instantly put it back into our bags. This is likely the last time you'll have to take out your clay block today, so be sure to consider if you should be adding some water to your bag. I will be adding some water to my bag. If you have a spray bottle, great. Otherwise, get some water in your hand from your bowl and just kind of splash it into your bag. Again, more water if your clay is dry, less if it seems like it's pretty good. Mine's a little on the dry side. I like my clay to be pretty soft. So as you can see, I'm adding a pretty good amount of water. And then I'm going to close up my bag with the least amount of air possible in there and set it to the side.